Welcome back to Catholic Reboot. I'm going to try something a little different here. There was a interview between Colleen Dooley, who is with Inside the Vatican, and Dr. Massimo Fagioli, and they will both introduce themselves. The reason I want to critique this is for a couple of reasons. Colleen Dooley, working for Inside the Vatican, actually reports to Dr. Robert Moynihan. Now, I know Dr. Moynihan because when Pope Benedict had issued his motu proprio from the seat of Peter, a directive, in 2007, freeing up the traditional Latin Mass and the traditional teachings of the Church, he declared it so. At that time, I had invited Dr. Moynihan to participate in a debate with a Father Richard Voigt, who was a former Salesian priest who had left the Novus Ordo and came over to the traditional Catholic faith. The debate didn't go very well. It actually broke down fairly quickly because Dr. Moynihan started to explain the influences that Father Annibale Bugnini had on Vatican II. And instead of just directly discussing the failure of Vatican II and how it really did not have the right to abrogate the traditional Latin Mass or the traditional Catholic doctrine, right? So when I saw Colleen from his magazine do the interview, my concern was, is this going to be a fair interview, all right? Well, I watched it all, and that's why I want to share it with you. And I will play it and only pause it to comment as I see certain comments need to be made. But what's interesting is in the very beginning, Colleen should have explained who this doctor of theology is. In other words, what is his disposition? Is he pro-Vatican II and against the traditional Latin Mass, or is he objective? You're going to see that he is pro-Vatican II, very much in disagreement with what Pope Benedict had done, and I'm going to comment on it as we go. Now, the reason I titled this episode Liberalism is Liberalism is it doesn't really matter if liberalism is in your culture, your politics, or your religion. It suffers the same fate. It has a smell of modernism, and it tends to liberate things that should never have been liberated. All right. Now, Pope Pius X, who came after Pope Leo, had issued a directive to all new priests coming out of the seminary that they would have to take an oath against modernism. That's how much he feared modernism and liberalism in the church. Now, Pope Pius X became Pope in 1903 and then died in 1914. What's interesting is Pope Paul VI, at the end of the 60s, I believe it was 1969, and once Vatican II had ended and was in full force, removed the requirement that priests should take an oath against modernism. That's very telling, and I'll make this point later on. But let's hear what they have to say, and again, I'm just going to pause as we go.
Hi, I'm Colleen Deli. Welcome to Behind the Story. Last week, the Vatican issued a new guideline saying that priests could no longer celebrate Mass alone without a congregation in St. Peter's Basilica, and it relegated celebrations of the Tridentine Latin Mass, that's the pre-Vatican II Mass, to one chapel in the crypt church of the Basilica. Joining me today to discuss these changes is Massimo Fagioli. He's a church historian and a professor of theology and religious studies at Villanova University. Welcome to the show, Massimo.
Thank you.
So Massimo, I want to start out by just laying out, this change has been phrased as an effort to continue implementing Vatican II. And I'm wondering if you can tell me, like, what exactly is it about these changes that were made that are implementing Vatican II?
So this change looks minimal because it is limited to St. Peter's Basilica, but actually it sends a very important message, which is that the celebration of Mass in the extraordinary form, which means in the pre-Vatican II rite, should be the exception and not the norm. And so this is important because what we have seen, especially since 2007, with...
Now I'm going to stop him right here. Notice he says that the extraordinary form. Okay, so for those that don't know, what Pope Benedict had done was, in order to free up the traditional Mass, he said that the Roman Rite had two Masses. One ordinary, which is the Novus Ordo Mass, and the second was the extraordinary, which is the traditional Mass. Now, it's very telling that he would call the traditional Mass the extraordinary, because it is extraordinary, right? His comment that the extraordinary or the traditional Latin Mass was only supposed to be used in exceptions, that's false. That is not what Pope Benedict said. Pope Benedict didn't say, well, it should only be used in limited cases. Pope Benedict said, and if you want, you need to read his motu proprio, wherever the faithful approach their priests to have this Mass said, they will provide this Mass. And he even went around the bishops who he knew would try to stop it. And since 2007, once it was freed up, the traditional Latin Mass has exploded. Okay? Now, this whole interview that they're having is around the fact that Pope Francis had just recently disallowed the traditional Latin Mass to be said in the Vatican. So for any of you that have been in the Vatican, you'll notice that when priests visit, they'll go and sign up to say Mass, and there's multiple altars which they can say Mass. So by Pope Francis stopping that, he's sending a direct message. This scares me. And why? Because many people are now requesting that Mass, and this puts a bullseye on the back of Vatican II. So he's very clever in the way he starts out. Now I'm going to let him go.
Pope Benedict XVI motu proprio of July 7, 2007, Summorum Pontificum, which tried to make peace between those who are happy with the liturgical reform of the Second Vatican Council, and those groups that are not happy with that and are more attached to the Latin Mass or the pre-Vatican II Mass. And so what we have seen since 2007 is, in my opinion, this dangerous tendency to see both rites at the same level, which was not the intent of Pope Benedict, and it was not even the intent of the special permissions that were given by John Paul II starting in 1984. And so this...
I'm going to pause him again. He's incorrect. When he said that Pope Benedict was using the same requirements as were under Pope John Paul II, who started to allow the traditional Mass to be said in very limited cases, that is not what Pope Benedict did. So he's not giving the facts, okay? What Pope Benedict said is it is not to be construed in a limited form, and it's not to be construed as restricted as it was under Pope John Paul II.
It is important because he sends messages, especially to those priests, clergy in Rome that study in Rome or spend some time in Rome, that the natural form of the celebration of the Mass is public, is with congregation. It shouldn't be private. And so that is important right now because it tends to correct a certain tendency to give privilege to the so-called Latin Mass, as if celebrating in Latin is more Catholic or more traditional. This is theologically not true, and the Vatican chose this.
Okay, let's listen to his comments. As an interview, Colleen needs to learn how to stop him and qualify what he's saying, because she's just letting him free fall. When he's alluding to the fact that the traditional Latin Mass could be somewhat harmful, because that's what he's trying to say. Just give it to these old people, right? Even though a lot of the young people are requesting it. What he does that most liberals do is they start everything in the middle of the story. What he doesn't say is the traditional Latin Mass was celebrated for 2,000 years before Vatican II came along. He's wiping all the history away as if it has no basis, and that this traditional Latin Mass should not only have not been resurrected under Pope Benedict, but it could actually be harmful to the faithful. Now listen to him.
This moment, and this way to say that, because there is a certain reluctance to accept this message in some quarters or in some circles of the Catholic Church.
Yeah, I want to ask you kind of maybe a bigger picture question about that, which is, why if Vatican II made these changes almost 60 years ago, why haven't they been implemented fully yet? Like, why are people still celebrating the pre-Vatican II Mass? How do you explain allowing that to happen?
So, what we have seen recently in these last few years may give the impression that there has been a failure since 1964, when Vatican II started implemented this. But actually, what we see between 1964 and the late 90s is a very peaceful and very rapid and very interesting implementation of that, which is monumental, because it was not just shifting from the Missal of 1570 in Latin, but it was about the enculturation of liturgy in different cultures, different languages, translations. I mean, a massive, massive undertaking. And so this has worked. What has happened, and I have to say this with all due respect, is that with the election of Pope Benedict, we had a pope that for the first time since Vatican II had become skeptical of the liturgical reform. His personal taste was for the pre-Vatican II Mass, and it's something...
Okay, incorrect. So he's injecting a lot of his own interpretation instead of sticking with the facts. He is saying that Pope Benedict, when he was a priest during Vatican II, was never really pro-Vatican II. Totally wrong. Matter of fact, Pope Benedict was one of the few priests, when he was priest Ratzinger, who was pro-Vatican II. And when he says, well, when he became Pope, he now had the choice or the chance to get rid of these reforms because he never really believed in it. That is not true either. When he says that the Novus Ordo Mass was hugely successful, totally incorrect. What Colleen needs to do is stop him and question him. That's why I'd love to have a debate with this knowledgeable doctor in theology, because he trips over history as if it doesn't exist. Pope Benedict saw the surge of the faithful saying, we want our Mass back and we want our church back. That's why Pope Benedict moved forward with the motu proprio. It's also very telling that he's the first pope in what, I don't know, 800 years that abdicated, right? You don't think the pressure was on him among the liberals in the Vatican Curia? Because what he launched was exactly what a significant number of Catholics wanted. They wanted their church back.
That happened to him many years after Vatican II, because during Vatican II he was very optimistic.
Right.
And so what we have seen is this, and so it's only a recent tendency that has seen a return, a revival of the Latin Mass, which is limited to some countries or some areas of the world and some specific kind of Catholics. It's not widespread to all Catholics, to all countries. It's typical of English-speaking countries.
Okay, so this is classic liberalism. What they do is they handcuff people, and then they say, well, there's not that many people that are representing a need. He is incorrect that it has not caught on, and I really don't care about the rest of the world. I care about the United States, and I've done a deep dive in the United States, and when I started practicing the traditional faith, bishops, priests, and cardinals refused parishes to offer the Mass. So this idea that he is saying that it was a novelty. I will tell you that wherever they had traditional Latin Masses, whatever city, they couldn't contain the Mass. They would explode. They would have instantly 1,500 parishioners for those Mass. And I personally was involved in parishes in Pittsburgh and Chicago where they did everything they could to disallow this Mass and disallow this traditional Catholic theology. He's incorrect again.
Mostly, or France, but one comparison,
what don't we know about French?
In Italy, where I come from, the fans of the Latin Mass are one tiny fraction of those who are big fans in the United States. It's applicable to all other countries, I would say.
Yeah, I want to ask you about that because
I'm sorry, I have to stop him again. He's talking about France. What he's not telling you, he's a great liberal move. If you're going to speak about France, then give the total statistics. How many practicing Catholics are in France? And of them, how many are traditional Catholics? See, it doesn't work to his narrative because the majority of practicing Catholics in France are traditional Catholics. Come on, Massimo.
The subsets of Catholics who like the Latin Mass, you see packed Latin Mass churches. And I'm curious about what you think this new guideline for St. Peter's Basilica might do to the existing divisions between the parts of the church that prefer the Tridentine Mass and the parts that prefer the Vatican II Mass.
It's a very difficult question. So directly, in the short run, will do nothing. What can accomplish is to subtract from that liturgical climate that young clergy can breathe in Rome, in the Vatican, a certain idea that liturgical formalism, traditionalism is the future. And so that can really give a different impact, a different feeling to those who, for work or study, spend in Rome months or years. And so that has a huge impact, because I remember that I studied for 1 year in Germany, and I went to Mass every day to the seminary where I was living, and that gives you a lot of ideas of it shapes your formation. And so that can have a long-term effect. Short-term, I don't think it will mean anything, because we know that those communities...
Okay, again, he's mixing apples and oranges. He said that he was studying in Germany. Germany, the Catholic Church in Germany is the most liberal, modernist church in the world. Him going to daily Mass in Germany is of no never mind. This is why if you read the book, The Rhine Flows into the Tiber, it was the Germans that were principally involved with a lot of this liberalism infecting Vatican II. So take Germany off the table in this discussion. We're talking about the Pope negating the Mass in Italy, in the Vatican, and what effect or what message that's sending, right?
That already have a vibrant climate liturgically will continue. And there's nothing wrong about that, as long as we don't think that this is going to be the future of the liturgy and that the old rite will absorb the new rite, because this is the big danger against which Pope Francis is warning us.
Yeah,
Okay.
I think that...
So he says, the old rite take over the new rite because this could be dangerous. You mean like the new rite took over the old rite? And how they, from 1965 all the way up to 2007, refused to allow Catholics to practice their traditional faith? You mean that kind of taking over? See, once again, liberals, when they set the agenda, it's one-sided. If their system failed, they will keep doubling down on it. He was talking about the good old days of all the efforts made from 1965 into the late 90s. The church lost 80% of its religious orders. The church lost more than 85% of its faithful. What are these great days? This is liberalism at its core. It's toxic. Now, he starts discussing the last 60 years as if the last 1,500 years since the Council of Trent never existed. Who took over what? She really needs to learn how to interview.
The point that you raised about the formation of priests is really interesting because, you know, any morning that you walk into St. Peter's Basilica when it's early, like 7:30, as soon as it opens up, already you see maybe 100 or 200 priests pass through over that first couple of hours in the day, and they go and they celebrate Mass alone, or maybe with one or two people following along with them, and it's so quiet you actually like almost can't hear them. But then when you kind of stick around, you realize that there are just so many people passing through. There's 46 altars, and you've got like 30 or 40 people saying Mass alone all at the same time. I want to ask you about the lay involvement, because I think that's a big part of this, right? Part of what makes going into St. Peter's early in the morning and seeing this happen when you're a layperson like me who has grown up with Vatican II, there's a disconnect, right, between you want to be in the church following along with the Mass, but you almost can't pick a Mass to follow along with. What does this new guideline say about involving lay people in the liturgy?
Okay, number one, she's dancing all over the place. She says, well, there are hundreds of priests, you know. Well, yeah, this is St. Peter's Basilica. You got priests visiting from all over the world. The requirement for a priest is to say his daily Mass. So they will go and they will be assigned an altar and they will say their Mass. Sometimes there's significant faithful there, sometimes there's not. If you've ever gone to the Vatican for Mass, you'll know what I'm talking about. This idea that she then says, well, I'm Vatican II, and it's distracting if it's not Vatican II. Okay, I'm not Vatican II. I'm a traditional Catholic. Now Colleen is playing a great liberal. My way or the highway, right? I was totally distracted by all the Novus Ordo priests saying their Masses, to be honest with you. But I didn't go and say, would you stop doing it because you're really bothering me as I'm trying to listen to the traditional Mass. This is classic liberalism, okay? They don't have a sense for the tradition, therefore the tradition should not exist. And here comes Massimo with the great rally cry.
Well, it says that Mass is essentially, by default, a celebration of the community. So I teach a course on Vatican II, and one of the photos that I showed to my student is of the bishops that were celebrating Mass before going to the Vatican for the assembly. And you see a row of the 20, 30 altars where every single bishop celebrated by himself. And so this makes no sense according to the theology of the Second Vatican Council, because it's, even if you celebrate alone as a priest, it's not your Mass. It's always the Mass of the Church. And so it's a contradiction to have a certain theology of the Church. And
now listen to what he's saying. I wish I would have interviewed this guy. He's saying the traditional Latin Mass is not a Mass of the community. It's a priest just saying the Mass with no respect for the faithful. Well, I don't know, 1,500 years they've been saying the Mass? The Mass is the holy sacrifice of the Mass, is the offering the priest is offering up to Christ. The people come through the priest. The priest does not come through the people. See, this is the liberalism of Vatican II. And what he's doing is completely throwing out the history of the church, as if shame on the Catholic Church for ever practicing its tradition, because it wasn't until Vatican II till they finally woke up. They may have contradicted every council before them. They may have contradicted every pope before them, but they know better because they're liberals.
Of the liturgy, and allowing hundreds of priests every day or every week to celebrate individually, because that is a distortion of the theology of the liturgy and of the church. And so it would make much more sense, and I think this is something they want to implement, to say there will be a Mass in this rite or in the other rite, one at 7, one at 7:30, and if you want to celebrate, please go there, and you can con-celebrate. But of course, con-celebration is something that can happen according to the Vatican II, right? And so here there has to be an acknowledgement at some point that the theology of the Church and of the liturgy of Vatican II are the theology of the Catholic Church.
No, sorry. No, it's not. Because Vatican II was never dogmatic or doctrinal. See how they do what liberals do? They change the rules and they say this is an exception, or this is a test, or this is pastoral. And then over time, it's like with politicians and hookers. They get credibility. I don't care if it's around 60 years or 80 years. Vatican II was never dogmatic, and its theology was not ever to replace the theology or the doctrine of the faith. He is willy-nilly stepping all over the doctrine and deposit of the faith, as if, I don't know where he got his doctorate, but as if he is the Pope himself, right? Well, he actually could be better than the Pope.
And this is the critical point, because you see that most fans of the old rite, so they say it's about the language, it's about the solemnity, but in one way or another, often the final target is Vatican II as such. And so there has been, and it's been made very clear in words, in texts, in chapters, books, that for some of them, the final goal is to revert or abrogate the reform of the Second Vatican Council, not just of the liturgy, but Vatican II as such. And this is very dangerous, and this is something against which Pope Francis has repeatedly said that this church is the church of the Second Vatican Council. It's unthinkable to go back, and so the liturgy is the first debate Vatican II started with in 62. If you want to undo Vatican II, you start by undoing the liturgy of the Second Vatican Council. And this is a danger, and here Francis is very aware of this, and he has never made a mystery about that.
Okay, so, Massimo, if Pope Francis wants to change something, you know what he does? He issues a bull, a motu proprio. He may even want to call a council to solidify the disaster that Vatican II has caused the church. But he won't. And you know why he won't? Because he loves doing his drive-by comments, just like he's doing with refusing to have the traditional Mass now celebrated in the Vatican, when the Pope before him did exactly that. So he's stepping all over Pope Benedict's motu proprio without issuing a motu proprio. This is classic liberalism. Now, Massimo says, well, you can't go back and undo because our theology is Vatican II. Apparently, the people don't like your Vatican II theology because it stinks. Okay, so it's not just the Mass, it's not just the smells and bells. It's the theology of the Catholic Church. It's the respect for the Holy Eucharist. It's the respect for confession. It's the respect for the Blessed Mother. He comes off with this high hat, stepping all over a pope that did it the right way and issued a directive, and supporting a pope who refuses to give a directive because he knows he'll probably be labeled a heretic.
You use that word danger a few times, and I'm wondering if you could talk about how you see that as dangerous.
It's dangerous not because the liturgy before Vatican II was bad.
Oh, thank you.
Or was not holy. I'm not saying that. I'm
you have
saying
no right to say
that
it.
What has happened in these last few years has been an unnatural division along the lines of different theologies of the.
So Pope Benedict did an unnatural act by returning the church to its doctrine and returning the church to its true Mass. This is what he's saying. It's an unnatural act.
Liturgy that is unnatural because it's different from the multiplicity that there is between the Roman Rite or the Ambrosian Rite or the Melkite Chaldean. And so here you have two Roman rites that, in the way they have been shaped in these last few years, it's impossible to think about them in terms of coexistence. Unfortunately, it has become a competition. And what is clear is that Vatican II wanted very clearly to have a reform of the liturgy of the church and not create a bi-ritual Roman Rite church. And so we have seen in some local context and in these last few months, for example, the bishops of France have published the report, and they say that in some local context that has created a division where Catholics don't see themselves as members of the church but members of this rite or the other rite. That is the danger. So it would be fun.
Okay, let me put an analogy down. Just like us as constitutional republic Americans do not see ourselves as part of the United States anymore because the liberals totally tore up our Constitution. They took away our right to free speech, right to assemble, right to practice our faith, right to free, fair election. Liberalism does this all the time. They destroy the institution, and then the first ones to come and say, well, you're not accepting this new thing that we created, so you must be on the outside. No. Just like our Constitution, the liberals destroyed the doctrine of our faith, destroyed our Mass, destroyed our devotions. And now they want to tell us, you need to go away. I'll tell you what's going to happen. You're going to have a schism in the Catholic Church if you let morons like this continue to represent the Catholic Church. We will not sit back. We will not listen to the liberals tell us how we need to practice our faith. The deposit of our faith gives sanctifying grace. Their religion is Protestantism at its best, and that's really knocking Protestants. I think the Protestants are probably better Catholics than the Novus Ordo. He's false. And this Colleen has to stop being a little millennial, and she's got to do her homework.
Fine if we were in 62 or 61 or 63. But now, after 2007, the impression has been given that these two rites are equal, and in some churches, in some seminaries also, the message has been that actually, if you really want to be a good Catholic, you should pray in Latin. This is against.
Okay, and I love when they do that. If you want to be a good Catholic, you have to pray in Latin. They always come in the middle of the argument. No, if you want to be a good Catholic, you have to follow the doctrine of the faith, Massimo. To be a good Catholic, you have to follow original catechism of the faith. To be a good Catholic, you have to actually look for sanctifying grace. To be a good Catholic, you need to have a Mass that is respectful to Christ. They always take these little things. Oh, you got to pray in Latin or sing in Latin or Gregorian chant. Your smells and bells. No, we have a devotion that Vatican II destroyed.
The spirit and the text of the Second Vatican Council, because it's not just about the language, it's the theology of the liturgy, what kind of scriptural passages you read or you don't read in liturgy. So here it's a problem of ecclesial division, and the Catholic Church is all about unity.
Always, I wanted to just slow this down a little bit, right? So we're looking at an interviewer that is not challenging the interviewee, right? Because he's a doctor, I think she's a little nervous, assuming he actually knows what he's talking about, all right? I'm going to play the rest of this. Now, this is going to be a long episode because I really want to go after everything he's saying, okay? And we're going to pick it up right now. She's going to start asking questions again.
I want to ask you kind of a historical question because you are a church historian, but then you also comment on current church issues in your column at Commonweal and all the other places that you write. And so you've seen the issues that have come up as we've had this kind of almost start and stop implementation of Vatican II. I know that you said earlier that it's been pretty peaceful, but then there's also been these kind of hiccups. And there's this saying that you hear a lot if you try to look at the history of the church, that it takes a century to implement a council, and we're 60 years into that now, looking at Vatican II. And I was wondering if you could just give some general context on why it takes so dang long.
Well, it takes long historically always. I mean, if we look at the Council of Trent, one of the most important innovations was the invention of the seminary for the formation of the priests, and we really don't have a seminary in the average diocese 1 century after the end of the Council. So this is very typical. For Vatican II, it's even more complicated. Why? Because Vatican II is about a reform or a renewal of the church in a global context. And so what was true for Trent was that you still operate in a cultural canon that is European and continental European, actually. It's about France and Spain and Germany and Italy.
Italy, of course.
And so here Vatican II exits from this canon, and so it takes a long time or different times in different areas to implement. And so what we see, for example, with the liturgy in North America is a crisis of growth, because we saw in the 1970s, 80s, very, very strong movement of implementation of the liturgy. And so we're coming back to that.
Okay, he's a church historian. Oh boy. Okay, so he's saying that the reason Vatican II was necessary is the Catholic Church eventually had to get away from its European roots, and especially with the United States, they had to do what? They had to do exactly what Pope Leo warned us they would do. They would start to inflict the church with Americanism. Number one. Number two, he's laying waste to all the great conversion the church went through since the time of Peter, when you had a pagan world, when the Germans were still squatting in the woods, when the Brits were still squatting in the woods, when the Japanese were still barbaric, when the Huns were still barbaric. He lays waste to all that as if there was no great accomplishment under the church, especially the Council of Trent. Like, all of a sudden, we just appeared with all these countries being fully Catholic. The Eastern Bloc, Poland, Slovakian, these were pagan countries. So did we give up our traditional faith in order to get these barbarians into the church? Church historians, he doesn't know what he's talking about. And if he's saying that the church had to liberalize because of the liberalization that was coming out of the United States, I'm going to even say that's not true. The experience in the United States was they were shunned against by the Protestants. They were given one state, the state of Maryland, and what ended up happening, the Catholic Church blossomed throughout the United States cities because it was the one holy apostolic church. He's making it seem that we can put Christ aside and we have to water down the church in order for it to be acceptable to the human being. See, this is the problem with liberalism. It's always about the same thing. Humanism, not Christ. When I was talking about the problem with ecumenism, they always put the people first and Christ last. They always make the change in favor of the people. They always make the change in favor of the truth to the people instead of the truth through the Holy Spirit. He's doing it again. Church historian. I'd love to see his credentials on that.
But if you go to in China, for example, we know that even in China, Latin Mass is quite popular. Why? Well, because Vatican II has barely arrived there. And so they still work with those manuals and those models. So it's not always about being conservative or being liberal. It's that there are cultural situations that are so different. And so,
Maximo, China? You're going to bring up China? China is under communist rule. The Chinese government appoint the bishops. They don't have the right to practice the faith any way than the Chinese government wants. You don't know what you're talking about. You can't even throw China in this discussion around Vatican II. If it was up to the Chinese, they're atheists. They'd destroy the whole church.
Vatican II, it will probably take even more time. And so
because it doesn't belong. It should be thrown out.
Message on ecumenism or on freedom of religion, it's very different being in North America or in Vietnam or in Australia or in Korea. I mean, so it really takes...
Okay, here's another problem with liberalism. It's all about the countries. You see, there can be a truth for Vietnam, there can be a truth for the United States, there can be a truth for Australia, there can be a truth for Europe. It's not the way Christ works, one truth. Okay? When it was one holy apostolic church, it was all the same. They didn't make... Now, you could have your different rites in the Catholic Church, which he referred to before, right? The Eastern Rite, the Maronite Rite, the Roman Rite. I get that. But none of those rites abrogated the theology of the church. That's why the Orthodox eventually split, because they wanted to do it their way in Constantinople. His history is flawed.
A long time. The importance of this is that there has to be a certain consistent view in the magisterium, in the teaching of the church about the whole theological basis of that. And so here Francis has no intention to suppress or silence those who like Latin Mass, but he's saying, look, you can have that Latin Mass, okay, you cannot have the theology of the 16th century that was at the basis of Latin Mass.
Here it go. Here we go. You can have the traditional Latin Mass, but you cannot have the traditional theology of the 16th century. What's he talking about? Council of Trent. They hate the Council of Trent. Why? Because the Pope said, if you touch this Mass, you'll be an anathema. They hate that, right? They do not want the Catholic doctrine, and they know if they let the traditional Catholic Mass continue, the doctrine's going to come with it. He just showed his true colors. His liberal skirt is showing now.
It's a distinction that it's important because that theology of the 16th century would automatically exclude vast areas of global Catholicism from becoming part of
from the 1960s forward.
So this is why we are here in this moment, which is natural, I think, but it's also natural for the Pope to say clearly where the theology of the Church is on the liturgy.
Can you give me some of the basics on
He's also a pope who has been trained in liberation theology in South America, which is communism melded with Catholicism, Massimo. To hang credibility on this pope and his view of the traditional Catholic Church is to give credibility to communism. And he's loving it.
Kind of the difference between the theology of the 16th century versus the theology of Vatican II, like how those show up in our worship?
So there is, first of all, a difference in ecclesiology. So we now operate with an idea of the church that is egalitarian, that is non-clerical, so where being member of the church is measured against your baptism and not against your ordination or your hierarchy. And so that makes a big difference in the way we are supposed to be part of the liturgy and of the participation.
I got to stop him again. Here he goes. We no longer are a church of hierarchy. We are no longer a church of the clergy. What's this sound like to you? Protestantism. Okay? The priests are the ones with the sacred hands to consecrate. The priests are the ones responsible for the holy sacrifice of the Mass. The Vatican II crowd wants the laity running it all. Just like you see in the Sunday Mass in all the Novus Ordo churches. There's a bunch of women up there floating communion out like a bunch of frisbees. The priest is sitting in a chair like a bumpkin. There's no hierarchy. They break all the rules, but guess what? On a humanistic level, everybody's doing kumbaya. This is what he's saying. That needed to go, and thank God the people are in control of the church and not the clergy. He's really cute with that line.
And so on. And so one example is that what Vatican II has said on ecumenism and on the Jews has huge implications on the liturgy because, I mean, evidently we now read at Mass regularly from the Old Testament. Because Jesus was Jewish and he never left Judaism behind. And if you never read from the Old Testament or Jewish scriptures, you will never understand what Jesus was about. And so that is...
Wait a minute. This guy's got a degree. This guy's a hack. He's saying Christ never left the Jewish faith behind. I don't know. I mean, everything I learned is as soon as he died on the cross, the temple was split. And the Jews were no longer the covenant. It was the new covenant. The Mass now has to have more Old Testament in it because we need to remember Christ was a Jew and he never gave up the Jewish faith. Where's this guy get his degree? He's breaking all the requirements of the Catholic Church. It's amazing she's letting that one go.
Is a huge difference because, of course, we don't have that in the 16th century. But again, it's not because they were bad Christians. It's because it takes time for the whole church to grow.
Oh yeah,
in
nod.
Understanding.
Keep nodding, Colleen.
God's
you don't know what the hell he's
revelation
talking about.
And so this is just one other example that it's not the same thing. I mean, celebrating in the liturgy of 1570 and of 1964 or 69, it is a different sense of the church and of communion with the whole people of God and with the whole creation, all humanity. And so this is why it is dangerous, because it could give an impression of relativism from a conservative point of view. Well, it's the same. Well, it's not.
He's saying it could be risky because it's become relativism. No, that's exactly what Vatican II was. It was trying to be relevant to the modern culture instead of the church. He has a big problem with the Council of Trent. Every time you hear him say the 1570s, he's talking about Trent. And like I said before, the problem he has with Trent made it clear, do not touch the theology, the doctrine, or the Mass. That's period. Future popes can't go and undo what the church had decreed before. This is a novelty of the Catholic Church, the new Catholic Church.
It's different. And so here, ecclesiology and liturgy are really one in the liturgical reform. If you change the liturgy, it's because you change a certain understanding of the church, of the members of the church, of priesthood, of course, because we no longer accept the idea that only the priest celebrates and we observe. We are the audience. And we are co-celebrants. And so...
Hear what he said? No longer does the priest celebrate the Mass and we observe. We are co-celebrants. Guess what? We all now have the sacrament of Holy Order. This is right from his mouth. We don't need a priest. We all have the right to be in charge of the Mass. He also said prior to that, if you change the liturgy, you change the theology. So let me ask, this is the first question I'd have. Colleen, you really need to learn your job. I'd say to him, Massimo, what theology do we currently use in the Novus Ordo? Is it Thomistic theology? Or is it liberation theology? See, he keeps skirting around. What is this theology of Vatican II? It's a communist liberal theology. They cannot have the Council of Trent mess around with this liberation theology.
This is not really part of the theology of the 16th century.
Right, yeah, we have this idea that our theological beliefs need to be reflected in our worship, right? This phrase, lex orandi, lex credendi, right? The way we pray shows what we believe.
Colleen, are you a Protestant? Do you really struggle to talk about the Mass? Why is it always worship? That's a Protestant term. Our theology has to reflect our worship. You mean the holy sacrifice of the Mass? I know that sounds pretty Catholic. It's the holy sacrifice of the Mass. And the theology needs to reflect the true Mass.
Massimo, I appreciate the chance to get your perspective on this and get some more historical context from somebody who knows the history really well. So thanks for taking the time to join us. He
doesn't know what he's talking about, Colleen. Neither do you. Do your job.
And for our viewers
Dr.
at
Moynihan,
home, thanks for joining us.
You really need to get your act together with your magazine and your staff. And I'm going to call you out. The next time I put on a debate, I'm not going to put a priest up on the stage with you, Dr. Moynihan. I'm going to be on the stage with you. The other thing is, where are you getting your staff from? She did one of the worst interviews I've ever seen. She neither explained who this doctor is, what his preference of theology is, nor did she even give him a tough question. It was like watching a CNN interview of Joe Biden. Shame on you.